It was the night of August 21st, 1968, a seemingly quiet evening in the Tuscan countryside. Antonio, a 29-year-old bricklayer, and Barbara, a 32-year-old housewife, had parked their car on a dirt road near the cemetery, seeking a moment of intimacy away from prying eyes. In the back seat slept Barbara's son, Natalino, just 6 years old. That night, Barbara and Antonio could not have imagined that their moment of intimacy would turn into a nightmare. As they laughed and exchanged affection, unaware of the lurking danger, a sinister shadow approached their car. Barbara's heart began to beat faster when she heard a sudden rustle of leaves. A shiver of fear ran down her spine. But before she could say anything, gunshots shattered the silence of the night. 8 gunshots, fired at close range, struck the couple, killing them instantly. The assassin vanished into the darkness, leaving behind a scene of horror and a terrified child.
When I learned about that brutal crime, something stirred inside me. I was Helen, a young journalist just starting out. But I felt that story concealed much more than a simple crime of passion. There was a darkness in those events that both attracted and frightened me. I decided to start investigating on my own, driven by a thirst for truth and a desire for justice for those innocent victims. I could not have imagined that choice would lead me to confront one of the most complex and disturbing cases in Italian criminal history.
The investigations into the Signa murder quickly focused on Stefano, Barbara's husband. The man, after an initial attempt at misdirection, confessed to the crime and was sentenced to 14 years in prison. However, the investigators were not entirely convinced by his version of events. Natalino, the surviving child, was found the following morning miles away in a state of shock. The circumstances of his discovery raised doubts and questions that would haunt the investigations for years to come.
As I studied the Signa case, I couldn't help but think there was something more, a sinister shadow looming over that seemingly solved murder. The contradictory testimonies, the details that didn't add up. Everything seemed to suggest the truth was much more complex than one could imagine. As I delved deeper and deeper into that maze of mysteries, I could not have imagined that the Signa murder was just the first piece of a mosaic of horror that would haunt Tuscany for years. The shadow of the night had only begun to reveal its darkest secrets.
Years passed, but the shadow of the Signa murder continued to loom over Tuscany. It was 1974 when a new horror shook the region. On September 14th, in the town of Borgo San Lorenzo, the lifeless bodies of Pasquale and Stefania, a young engaged couple, were found on an isolated road. Pasquale and Stefania had chosen that secluded spot to spend a few moments of intimacy, unaware of the horror that awaited them. As they held each other close, the monster approached, silent and lethal like a predator in the night. When Stefania heard the footsteps approaching, a primordial terror gripped her. She tried to scream to warn Pasquale, but it was too late. Gunshots echoed in the night, followed by the chilling sound of stabbing. In a few terrible instants, the young couple was ripped from life, victim of a senseless homicidal fury. The similarities with the Signa case were disturbing. Both crimes had been committed in secluded areas, targeting young couples. But at the time, no one connected the two events, and the investigations proceeded separately.
When I learned about the Borgo San Lorenzo murder, a shiver ran down my spine. There was something all too familiar about that crime, a sinister echo that brought me back to the unsolved Signa case. I decided to deepen my research, poring over archives and interviewing witnesses. The more I dug, the more convinced I became that there was a connection between the two murders, a red thread of blood that tied them together in a spiral of horror.
The 1980s brought a new wave of terror. Between 1981 and 1985, 6 more couples were brutally murdered in the Tuscan countryside, following a macabre and repetitive ritual. The victims were shot with a gun, and the women suffered atrocious mutilations. Fear spread among the population, and the press began to speak of a serial killer, a mysterious assassin who seemed to target secluded couples. It was then that the infamous nickname was born, the Monster of Florence.
With each new murder, my determination to uncover the truth grew stronger. I was convinced that there was a single diabolical mind behind that trail of blood, a ruthless and methodical killer who openly defied law enforcement. But the investigation seemed to grope in the dark, unable to find a common thread between the murders. False suspects, leads that turned into dead ends, misdirection. The case of the Monster of Florence was turning into an increasingly intricate maze.
It was only in 1982, after the fifth double murder, that the investigators realized a disconcerting detail. The bullets found at the crime scene matched those used in the 1968 Cigna murder. Suddenly, the circle was closing. The monster had struck for the first time 14 years earlier. This connection shed new light on the investigations, but also raised disturbing questions. Who was the Monster of Florence? What was his motive? And above all, how had he managed to elude justice for so long? As Tuscany plunged into terror, Helen was determined to find the answers to those questions. Her search for the truth would lead her to confront the darkest sides of human nature, on a journey into the heart of darkness of the Monster of Florence. Carmela and Giovanni had secluded themselves on that country road, seeking a moment of intimacy. They felt safe in each other's embrace, unaware of the horror that was about to befall them. Suddenly, the sinister glow of a flashlight illuminated the car's interior. Before they could realize what was happening, a series of gunshots shattered the quiet of the night. Giovanni was fatally shot, while Carmela, wounded and terrified, was dragged out of the car. Her attacker set upon her with inhuman ferocity, inflicting deep wounds with a bladed weapon. Her heart-rending screams were lost in the darkness until silence reigned again, broken only by the killer's panting breath. As the murders multiplied, the pressure on the investigators to find the culprit grew ever more intense. The investigations initially focused on the Sardinian lead, linked to the first murder in 1968. Stefano, Barbara's husband, had in fact accused some of his acquaintances, all of Sardinian origin, of being the real perpetrators of the murder. Among the suspects were Francesco, a former lover of Barbara, and his brother, Salvatore. Stefano's accusations, however, proved inconsistent, and the Sardinians were exonerated. But the shadow of suspicion continued to hang over them, fueled by rumors and gossip.
As I followed the developments of the investigations, I couldn't help but think that the truth was more complex than it seemed. The Sardinian lead, although suggestive, had too many weak points and contradictions. I decided to dig deeper, interviewing the protagonists of that story. I met Francesco, Barbara's former lover, who told me his version of the facts. The man proclaimed his innocence, but in his eyes I read a deep uneasiness, as if he were hiding an unspeakable secret.
In the following years, the investigations took different directions, following leads that later turned out to be dead ends. Suspicions thickened around various individuals, from local voyeurs to characters with mental disorders. But none of them turned out to be the infamous monster. It was only in 1991 that a name emerged forcefully: Pietro, a farmer in the area with a violent past. The man had already been convicted of a crime of passion in 1951, and some witnesses placed him near the crime scenes.
When Pietro came under the spotlight of the investigation, I felt that maybe we were about to reach a turning point. The man seemed to embody all the elements of the criminal profile drawn up by the experts: above-average intelligence, a deep misogyny, a repressed rage ready to explode. But as I watched the trial against Pietro, I couldn't help but feel a sense of unease. The evidence against him was circumstantial, based on contradictory testimonies and fragile clues. Was he really the Monster of Florence, or were we witnessing a tragic miscarriage of justice?
Pietro was sentenced to life imprisonment in the first instance, but subsequently acquitted on appeal for lack of evidence. The verdict sparked controversy and heated debates, dividing public opinion. Some saw him as the monster finally unmasked, others as a scapegoat victim of a sloppy investigation. The truth seemed to slip away, shrouded in the mists of doubt and ambiguity. As Pietro returned to freedom, Tuscany plunged back into the nightmare with the awareness that the real Monster of Florence might still be out there, ready to strike again. Susanna and Stefano had found refuge in that corner of the woods, hoping to escape the chaos of the world for a few hours. Sitting in their car, they exchanged sweet words and tender caresses, dreaming of a future together. But the monster was lurking, ready to turn their dreams into an endless nightmare. A sudden noise made them jump. Before they could understand what was happening, a hail of bullets rained down on the car. Stefano died instantly while Susanna, seriously injured, tried desperately to escape, but her assailant caught up with her, unleashing an unprecedented violence upon her. Her heart-rending screams echoed through the night until silence fell again on the woods, broken only by the rustling of the trees and the killer's panting breath. After Pietro's acquittal on appeal, the investigations into the Monster of Florence seemed to have reached a dead end. But a new line of investigation opened up when the attention of the investigators focused on a group of friends linked to Pietro: Mario, Giancarlo, and Fernando, known as the Snack Companions. The three men, all residents of the same area as the murders, were accused of being Pietro's accomplices in the crimes. In particular, Giancarlo, an unemployed man with alcohol problems, accused himself of having participated in some of the murders, together with Pietro and Mario.
When I learned about Giancarlo's confessions, I felt conflicting emotions. On the one hand, I finally saw a possible solution to the mystery that had obsessed me for years. On the other hand, I couldn't help but doubt the genuineness of those statements. I decided to dig deeper into the lead of the Snack Companions, interviewing people close to them and carefully studying the interrogation reports. The more I dug, the more shadows and contradictions emerged. Giancarlo's confessions appeared confused, full of implausible details and inconsistencies.
Despite the doubts, the Snack Companions were indicted. The trial, which began in 1998, ended with the life sentence for Mario and Giancarlo, found guilty of 4 of the 8 double murders. Fernando, on the other hand, was sentenced for aiding and abetting. The verdict, however, did not put an end to the controversy. Many observers contested the solidity of the evidence against the defendants, underlining how Giancarlo's confessions had been obtained under unclear and potentially suggestive circumstances.
Following the trial of the Snack Companions, I couldn't help but feel a deep unease. Something about that affair didn't add up, as if we were witnessing a gigantic miscarriage of justice. I continued to investigate on my own, interviewing witnesses overlooked by the prosecution and analysing unpublished documents. The further I went, the more convinced I became that the truth was still far away. Too many questions remained unanswered, too many details didn't add up.
With the conviction of the Snack Companions, the case of the Monster of Florence seemed closed. But for many, that verdict represented only a partial and unsatisfactory truth. Doubts and questions continued to swirl, fueling alternative theories and conspiracy hypotheses. As Tuscany tried to leave the nightmare of the monster behind, Helen was determined not to abandon her search for the truth. She knew that the true face of Italy's most ferocious killer was still shrouded in shadow, hidden behind a veil of mysteries and misdirection. Her investigation would lead her to confront the darkest sides of the human soul and the unmentionable secrets of a land marked by blood. But Helen was ready for anything to tear away the veil of silence and lies that enveloped the case of the Monster of Florence. Despite the conviction of the Snack Companions, the case of the Monster of Florence continued to raise doubts and perplexities. Many observers contested the solidity of the evidence against the defendants, underlining the inconsistencies in Giancarlo's confessions and the lack of objective evidence. Meanwhile, new leads and suspicions emerged, casting further shadows on the affair. Some witnesses spoke of alleged esoteric rituals and satanic sects linked to the murders, fueling conspiracy theories and morbid suggestions.
In fact, during my investigations, I also came across a lead that led to a dark world of esoteric rites and human sacrifices. Some witnesses spoke of strange symbols found at the crime scenes, ancient books, and blasphemous ceremonies. At first, I was skeptical, but the more I dug, the more I realized that this theory, however controversial, could not be ignored. Digging deeper into the esoteric lead, I discovered disturbing details that seemed to link to the monster's crimes. Some witnesses spoke of strange, hooded figures spotted in the woods around Florence, improvised altars and mysterious symbols carved on trees. But it was when I learned about the mutilations suffered by the female victims that a shiver of pure horror ran down my spine. Those women had been subjected to terrible rituals, their bodies desecrated in an unspeakable way. Was the monster performing human sacrifices for some dark purpose? The idea repulsed me, but I couldn't ignore that macabre possibility. Perhaps behind the monster's mask, an even more sinister and disturbing design was hidden. Every lead I followed seemed to lead to a new dead end, to a new maze of suspects and counter-accusations. One day I received a call from an anonymous informant who claimed to have crucial information about the case. The man, in a trembling voice, told me about secret meetings and blasphemous rites in which unsuspected characters of the Florentine upper class had participated. Among them, he named a well-known local doctor, Dr. Francesco.
The informant's statement threw new fuel on the fire of controversy. Dr. Francesco, a respected professional, was investigated for alleged involvement in the monster's murders. According to some, the doctor was at the head of an esoteric sect that commissioned the crimes for ritual purposes. The investigations on Francesco, however, led to nothing concrete. The man was exonerated for lack of evidence, but the shadow of suspicion continued to loom over him. For many, he represented the symbol of a hidden and disturbing truth, the repulsive face of evil that lurked in the city's good parlors.
The revelations about Dr. Francesco prompted me to investigate the esoteric lead more deeply. I interviewed occultism experts, studied ancient ceremonial texts, trying to find a link between the murders and alleged satanic rituals. But the more I dug, the more I realized how slippery and ambiguous that trail was. The evidence was flimsy, the testimonies contradictory. It seemed we were chasing ghosts, projecting our darkest fears onto an already complex and painful affair.
Over the years, the case of the Monster of Florence was heading towards a slow and inexorable closure. The official culprits had been convicted, the investigations closed. But for many, the truth remained elusive, buried under layers of secrets and omissions. Helen, however, was not willing to give up. She knew there were still too many grey areas, too many unanswered questions. Her search for the truth would lead her to confront the darkest sides of human nature and the deepest mysteries of the human soul. As the case of the Monster of Florence seemed to be heading towards oblivion, new revelations emerged, casting a sinister light on the affair. A collaborator of justice, linked to organized crime, made shocking statements about an alleged involvement of the mafia in the monster's murders. According to the informant, the murders were commissioned by members of the underworld to intimidate and blackmail prominent figures in Tuscan society. The snack companions were mere material executors, pawns in a broader and more disturbing criminal design.
When I learned about the revelations of the collaborator of justice, I felt a shiver of horror. The idea that the monster's murders could be linked to mafia plots and dark power games left me stunned and in disbelief. I decided to investigate that lead, aware of the risks I would run. I met the informant in a secret location, listening to his voice as he recounted the chilling details of what seemed to be a truth too uncomfortable and dangerous to be revealed.
Some journalists and magistrates began to investigate that lead, but they ran into a wall of silence and threats. Key witnesses retracted their statements, documents mysteriously disappeared, people who knew too much were silenced.
The more I dug into the mafia lead, the more I realized how dangerous it was to venture into that territory. I received veiled threats, pressures to abandon my investigations. But I couldn't back down, not now that the truth seemed closer than ever.
Despite the difficulties and dangers, Helen did not give up. She continued to investigate, to gather testimonies and documents, to try to shed light on that dark plot that seemed to envelop the case of the Monster of Florence. But the closer she got to the truth, the more she realized how difficult it was to bring it to light. Powerful and hidden forces seemed to oppose any attempt to shed light on the matter, to reveal the secrets hidden behind years of murders and terror. Helen knew that her fight for truth would lead her to confront the darkest sides of power and corruption. But she was determined to go all the way to uncover that Pandora's box that was the case of the Monster of Florence. Because she knew that only the truth, however painful and uncomfortable, could do justice to the victims and restore dignity to a land wounded by evil and silence. Only the truth could defeat the shadow of the monster, finally freeing Tuscany from its deadly embrace. As the revelations of the collaborator of justice shook public opinion, a new element emerged, casting a shadow of doubt on the entire affair of the Monster of Florence. A former policeman, on his deathbed, made a shocking confession. He said he was aware of evidence that could exonerate the snack companions and point to the real culprit of the murders. According to the former agent, the investigations had been deliberately diverted, the evidence manipulated to frame the suspects. Behind this machination was a diabolical mind, an unsuspected figure who had orchestrated everything to hide the truth and protect himself.
When I learned about the former policeman's confession, I felt a sense of vertigo. Could it really be that we had followed a false lead for all those years? That the real perpetrators of the murders were still at large, protected by a network of complicity and silence? I decided to meet the former agent, to hear from his voice the details of that shocking revelation. The man, consumed by illness and remorse, told me about a parallel investigation, hidden evidence and manipulated witnesses. And he gave me a name. The name of the one who had orchestrated everything, Dr. Massimo, a respected professional in the city.
The former policeman's accusations threw the entire Monster of Florence affair into chaos. Dr. Massimo, until then unsuspected, came under the spotlight of a new investigation. Disturbing links emerged with some of the murders, clues that seemed to connect him to the trail of blood that had shocked Tuscany. But Dr. Massimo reacted strongly to the accusations, denouncing a plot against him. He spoke of slander, of an attempt to tarnish his reputation, and he found important support, people willing to defend him and discredit the former policeman's revelations.
I found myself at the centre of a media and judicial storm. On the one hand, those who believed in Dr. Massimo's guilt and demanded justice for the victims. On the other hand, those who cried conspiracy and defended the doctor's innocence. I myself was torn by doubt. The evidence against Massimo was circumstantial, open to conflicting interpretations. And the more I dug into his life, the more grey areas and contradictions emerged. Was he really the monster who had terrorised Tuscany for years, or was he just a scapegoat, the victim of a machination bigger than him?
The case of the Monster of Florence was heading towards a new controversial chapter. Investigations were reopened, trials were held, but the truth seemed to slip away, shrouded in mystery and ambiguity. For Helen, the search for justice had become a personal matter. She knew she would find no peace until she discovered the truth, until she looked into the eyes of the one truly responsible for so much suffering. But the deeper she delved into that maze of secrets and lies, the more she realized how elusive and painful the truth could be, and how evil sometimes could hide behind the unsuspected face of normality. As the case of Dr. Massimo divided public opinion, new elements emerged, casting further uncertainty on the affair of the Monster of Florence. Witnesses came forward, claiming to have seen the doctor in the company of some of the victims shortly before the murders. Others spoke of strange rituals and secret meetings in which Massimo allegedly took part. But the evidence once again was fragile and contradictory. Every lead seemed to lead to a dead end. Every revelation clashed with denials and counter-accusations. The truth, cloaked in shadows and secrets, seemed to elude every attempt to grasp it.
I was exhausted, consumed by years of investigation and disappointment. I had sacrificed everything to pursue the truth about the Monster of Florence, to give a face and a name to the horror that had shocked my land. But the closer I got to the end, the more the goal seemed to recede. One day I received an anonymous envelope. Inside, photos and documents that seemed to connect Dr. Massimo to a circle of occult rites and human sacrifices. It was the evidence I had been searching for years, the key to finally unravelling the mystery of the monster.
The new evidence against Dr. Massimo unleashed a veritable media and judicial earthquake. The doctor was arrested, accused of being the instigator, if not the material perpetrator, of the murders of the Monster of Florence. The trial that followed was one of the most controversial and followed in Italian history. Massimo declared himself innocent, denouncing a plot against him. He spoke of fabricated evidence, manipulated witnesses, a machination orchestrated by occult powers.
I followed the trial with bated breath, aware that in those courtrooms the final word was being written on an affair that had consumed me for years. I listened to the testimonies, examined the evidence, trying to discern the truth in the tangle of shadows and lies. In the end, the verdict came like a bolt from the blue. Dr. Massimo was found guilty, sentenced to life imprisonment as the instigator of the Monster of Florence murders. The truth finally seemed to have triumphed.
But as Tuscany tried to leave the nightmare of the monster behind, a question continued to torment Helen. Was it really over? Could one person have orchestrated such a vast and senseless horror? Helen knew that the truth often is more complex than it appears, that behind the monster's face often lie other shadows, other secrets, and that evil sometimes has its roots in a terrain darker and deeper than one can imagine. And this evil can be anywhere.